Dennis Hallman's Speedo incident. Dennis Hallman's Speedo at UFC 133 is something the UFC definitely wants you to forget. In August 2011, Hallman walked out wearing something that had everyone doing a double take. A tiny blue Speedo that left almost nothing to the imagination. Apparently, he lost a bet and had to wear it. But nobody in the arena was laughing, especially not Dana White. The whole thing was super awkward. You've got two grown men fighting in a cage, and one of them is wearing what amounts to a banana hammock, while the other had an arrow shaved into his chest. Dana was so uncomfortable with it that he straight up said it would never happen again. Fans were roasting it online. Fighters were confused, and the UFC looked kind of silly letting it slide. Hallman ended up getting TKO'd in the first round, and Dana White was so relieved he gave Brian Ebersol a $70,000 bonus just for getting Hallman off the screen fast. His contract was never renewed after that, and he kind of vanished from the UFC quietly. That fight forced the UFC to officially ban Speedo-style shorts. Now, fighters have to wear approved gear that's way more professional. To this day, if you Google Dennis Hallman, the Speedo picture is the first thing that shows up. It's what most people remember him for, which is wild, considering he had a solid MMA career before that. GSP's Vaseline controversy. Greasegate. GSP fought BJ Penn in a huge champ versus champ fight at UFC 94. GSP was the welterweight champ, and BJ was the lightweight king moving up. But what ended up stealing the spotlight wasn't the fight. It was the controversy that followed. Between rounds, GSP's cornermen were seen rubbing Vaseline on his face, which was normal. But then they were caught rubbing his shoulders and back too, which is a big no-no in MMA. Vaseline is only supposed to go on the face to reduce cuts. If you put it on the body, it can make you super slippery and hard to grapple or take down. BJ Penn's camp noticed what was happening and freaked out, saying GSP was basically greasing to gain an unfair advantage. They argued that it was almost impossible for BJ to lock in submissions or control GSP because he was too slippery. After the fight, BJ was nervous, and even Dana White was caught on camera ranting a bit, backing up BJ. The Nevada State Athletic Commission actually launched an investigation after the fight, and while the result didn't get overturned, they agreed that something shady went down. That led to the UFC tightening up rules on who could apply Vaseline and how. Now, only official cutmen are allowed to put Vaseline on fighters. And they're heavily monitored. No more coaches getting involved with that stuff. If you're enjoying this breakdown of UFC scandals that changed the rules, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. We've got plenty more crazy stories coming up. Tank Abbott throwing fighters out the cage. Back in the Wild West days of the UFC, Tank Abbott was known for being an absolute savage. At UFC 11, he fought Cal Worsham, and things got out of control real fast. Tank dropped Worsham with some heavy punches, and then, in true Tank fashion, he just lost it. He straight up tried to throw Worsham out of the octagon. He picked him up and flung him toward the fence like he was tossing out the trash. And here's the craziest part. Cal almost flew completely out. His body was halfway over the top, and the only thing that stopped him was the cage padding he managed to grab onto. At the time, the UFC didn't have specific rules about that kind of stuff because no one thought a fighter would literally try to eject someone mid-fight. But after that, the UFC added clear rules, banning the act of throwing or pushing fighters out of the cage. It was dangerous, obviously, and it was a bad look for the sport. Tank Abbott already had a reputation for being unpredictable and violent. But this incident pushed the UFC to tighten things up. No more WWE-style body launches. TKOs becoming a thing. Back at UFC 1, there were basically no rules. Fights could only end by knockout, submission, or if the fighter's corner threw in the towel. That's it. Referees weren't even allowed to stop fights, no matter how bad things got. The idea came from UFC co-founder Rorion Gracie, who wanted the fights to feel raw and real. No interference, just letting it play out. But then Gerard Gordeau happened. In UFC 1, Gerard landed a brutal kick to sumo wrestler Tila Tuli's face and literally kicked one of his teeth into the crowd. There was blood everywhere. Even though the rules said no stoppages, the ref stepped in anyway. That didn't sit well with Gracie, who was furious that the fight got stopped. After that, Gracie went to his good friend Big John McCarthy and asked him to start refereeing for the UFC moving forward. Then came UFC 2, and things got even sketchier. Pat Smith was absolutely wrecking Scott Morris, just raining down punches, while Morris was clearly done. But the ref just stood there, because he wasn't allowed to stop it. It looked horrible and dangerous, and it made a lot of people question what the UFC was doing. Big John, who was still new as a referee at the time, had enough. He told Gracie straight up, "If you don't let me stop fights, I'm not doing this." And that was the turning point. Starting at UFC 3, referees were finally given the power to stop fights when things got out of hand. It took 2 events, a flying tooth and a potential murder to get there. But that's how referee stoppages became a permanent part of the UFC. Position after checks. At UFC 42, Dwayne Ludwig found himself in a rough spot. He was on his back getting cooked. Big John McCarthy paused the fight so the doctor could check out the cut, which is standard. But here's where things got weird. Once the doctor gave the green light, they didn't restart the fight on the ground where it left off. Instead, they stood both fighters up and restarted it on the feet. That was a huge break for Ludwig. He was struggling on the ground, but once he got back to striking range, he found his rhythm again. He ended up edging out a close decision. While it was a solid comeback, a lot of people, especially Dana White, weren't happy about how it played out. Dana straight up said it made no sense to reset a fight standing when it was clearly paused in a ground position. The guy on top just loses his advantage for no reason. That's not fair, and he was right. It wasn't. That moment exposed a flaw in the rulebook, and the UFC fixed it. After that fight, the rules were updated. If a fight gets paused due to a doctor check or equipment issue, it has to resume in the exact same position it was stopped. Jon Jones and UFC 232 relocation. This one's wild, even for Jon Jones standards. Back in 2018, Jones was scheduled to fight Alexander Gustafsson at UFC 232. Fans were hyped. It was a big rematch, and Vegas was set to host the whole thing. But then, right before fight week, Jon Jones failed another drug test. This time it wasn't for anything new, just a tiny trace of steroid metabolite still in his system from past use. The Nevada State Athletic Commission wasn't having it. With the holidays around the corner, they said they needed more time to review everything and weren't comfortable clearing him to fight. So what did Dana White do? With less than a week before fight night, he made a wild decision and moved the entire event from Las Vegas to California. The California State Athletic Commission looked at the situation and cleared Jones almost immediately. Just like that, the show was back on, but in a completely different state. It was absolute chaos. Fans who bought tickets and booked flights to Vegas were left scrambling. Every fighter on the card was mad. They had to rearrange travel, training, and fight week schedules. Some of them couldn't even bring their full teams because it was all so last minute. And what did Jon Jones do? Nothing. He showed up, fought, and won back his belt. The favoritism couldn't have been more obvious. If this had been any other fighter, the bout would have been canceled on the spot. But because it was Jon Jones, one of the UFC's biggest stars, Dana made it happen. It didn't matter who got screwed along the way. Towelgate, DC's weight cut drama. DC is one of the most respected guys in MMA. Olympic wrestler, double champ, and just a solid dude. But at UFC 210, he pulled something a little shady. It was the day before his title fight against Anthony Rumble Johnson. DC steps on the scale and comes in a pound over at 206. He steps off, looks flustered, and everyone's thinking he's going to have to cut more weight or lose the belt. But then, just 2 minutes later, he comes back, steps on the scale again, and suddenly he's 205 flat. Magically dropped over a pound in 120 seconds without sweating, running, or cutting. Everyone was confused, but fans online quickly noticed that he was leaning on the towel. DC had his hands lightly pressed down on the towel that his team was holding up to cover him. If you watch the footage, you can literally see him glancing down, adjusting his hands, making sure the towel was just right. The internet went nuts, and that's how Towelgate came about. To his credit, DC eventually admitted it years later, saying, "I may have grabbed the towel in Buffalo." Yoel Romero's Stoolgate. At UFC 178, Yoel Romero was in serious trouble at the end of round 2 against Tim Kennedy. Kennedy rocked him with some huge shots, had him wobbling all over the octagon, and looked seconds away from finishing the fight. Luckily, the bell saved him. Now here's where things got shady. When it was time for round 3, Romero didn't get up. He just sat there on his stool. Everyone was confused. The ref kept telling him to stand up, but Romero just stayed seated. Turns out the UFC cut man put way too much Vaseline on Romero's eye, so they had to wipe it off. And that gave him an extra 28 seconds to recover, which in fight time is basically a full reboot. He came out swinging and knocked Kennedy out. Romero said, "I don't know what happened. The UFC man put too much Vaseline." Even Dana later admitted it was the UFC's mistake and not Romero's fault. The Reebok deal. When the UFC signed an exclusive deal with Reebok back in 2015, it was supposed to be a big step toward making the sport look more professional. Uniforms, cleaner branding, standardized gear. It sounded like the right step, but for the fighters, it was a financial nightmare. Before Reebok came in, fighters could wear whatever sponsors they wanted on their uniform. Some fighters, especially the lesser-known ones, made more money from sponsorships than from the actual fights. But when the Reebok deal started, all personal sponsors were banned. Fighters had to wear UFC-issued gear with just the Reebok logo, and the money they got for it was way less than what they used to make. Top fighters went from making tens of thousands in sponsor money to maybe a few grand per fight. Lower-level fighters got even less. It didn't matter how marketable or well-known you were. Everyone had to follow the same system, and most of them lost out big. The backlash was huge. Fighters spoke out, fans were annoyed, and even though the UFC tried to spin it as a step forward, it was clear who really benefited: the UFC and Reebok, not the people stepping into the cage. UFC 167, robbery. At UFC 167, GSP defended his welterweight title against Johnny Hendricks, and what happened that night is still debated to this day. On paper, GSP won by split decision, but if you actually watch the fight, you will most likely walk away thinking Johnny won that easily. Hendricks didn't just compete, he cooked GSP. He rocked him, cut him open, and landed the heavier shots all night. GSP definitely had some moments, but Hendricks was clearly doing more damage. Most people watching felt like Johnny won at least 3 rounds, maybe even 4. And it wasn't just the fans saying it. All 16 major MMA media outlets scored the fight for Hendricks. Even Dana White, who had every reason to back GSP since he was the UFC's biggest star at the time, said he was blown away that GSP won the fight. It's one of the most debated decisions in UFC history, and depending on who you ask, GSP might have walked away with a gift from the judges. Nick Diaz versus the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Nick is one of those rare fighters who never followed anyone's rules. He didn't care about being marketable. He just showed up, fought his heart out, and kept it real every time. So when Nick tested positive for marijuana after his fight at UFC 183, the Nevada State Athletic Commission decided to throw the book at him. They gave him a 5-year suspension and fined him $165,000. You know how insane that is? Fighters who test positive for steroids don't even get anywhere near this kind of punishment. They were treating Nick like a serial killer. He just smoked a little pot, something that half the roster has probably done at some point. The craziest part is one of the commission members literally said, "Your lawyers were very persuasive, but you don't respect us," and gave him 5 years. Nick didn't even get a fair shot to defend himself. The MMA community lost it. Fans, fighters, even Dana White said, "This is insane." Eventually, the pressure worked. They reduced the suspension to 18 months and dropped the fine to $100,000. But the damage was done. Nick felt like the system was out to get him, and honestly, it kind of was. They took his prime years away. Charles gets stripped. Charles Oliveira was set to defend his lightweight title against Justin Gaethje, but things got messy at the weigh-ins. He stepped on the scale and came in just half a pound over the 155-pound limit, even though his personal scale said he was on weight the night before. That tiny difference cost him everything. And it wasn't just him. A few other fighters on the same card also missed weight by exactly half a pound, which made it pretty clear something was off the scale. A lot of people started pointing that out, saying the scale was messed up. But regardless of what caused the issue, the UFC didn't hesitate. They stripped Charles of his title on the spot. Still, he went on to beat Justin in dominant fashion. He submitted him in the first round and looked every bit like the champ. But because of that weigh-in mess, the belt was already vacant. So even though Charles clearly proved he was still the best lightweight in the world, the fight didn't count as a title defense. If the scale had been right, this would have been his second straight title defense. Fans were furious. It felt like Charles was being punished for something that wasn't his fault. The blame clearly should have gone on the commission or the UFC. But instead, the guy who did everything right in the cage walked away empty-handed. The whole situation was just a mess. Shout out to Charles for taking it like a champ. Not going to lie, I would have caused a riot. These scandals didn't just create drama, they literally shaped the UFC into what it is today. From Speedo bans to weight-cutting protocols, from drug testing to media relations, every controversy forced the organization to evolve. The craziest part is that most of these rule changes seem obvious now, but it took actual disasters to make them happen. The UFC learned the hard way that you can't run a legitimate sport without legitimate rules. And honestly, we're probably not done yet. As MMA continues to grow and new situations arise, you can bet there will be more scandals that force the UFC to rewrite the rulebook once again. If you enjoyed this deep dive into UFC history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more breakdowns of the wildest moments in combat sports. And let me know in the comments, which scandal do you think had the biggest impact on the sport?